Let's get to our next discussion now. Many Nigerians have expressed concern over the country's rising debt profile as the Nigeria's Debt Management Office is asking the National Assembly to approve a Ways and Means loan of about 23 trillion naira from the Central Bank of Nigeria. The Director General, Patience Oniha, noted that Nigeria's total debt stock rose to 44 trillion naira as of the end of September 2022. Largely reflecting the weakness of the local unit in naira, while adding that if the CBN loans be added to the debt profile, the nation's debt portfolio would increase significantly. She said that securitization of the loans will enhance debt transparency, as it would then be included in the total public debt stock. But others are of the opinion that this request should not be approved. That is our crux for the next discussion. And joining us in the studio to discuss this is a political analyst who will help us also look at dynamics of this, Razak Olukoba. Thank you for joining us.
Mike, good morning. Good morning, viewers out there.
Welcome. And we also have via Zoom finance analyst Segun Elemo, as well as economist and immediate past Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Muda Yusuf. Gentlemen, it's good to have you join us on Zoom.
Thank you and good morning.
Good morning. Segun, I hope you can hear me.
Thank you for having me.
Great.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Very good. All right, let me start with Dr. Muda Yusuf. When we talk about Ways and Means loans, an average Nigerian on the street will certainly not understand what Ways and Means loan is and what the implication of that is. Can you help us simplify it so that an average Nigerian watching right now can understand? Because we're talking about some of these terms used by government.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Ways and Means is a credit facility, or you can also call it overdraft, that is provided by the Central Bank of Nigeria to the federal government to bridge financing gaps. So it's like a short-term facility. And over the years, the Central Bank has been making available this short-term financing facility to the federal government, because of just to bridge the gap between revenue and expenditure. And the whole idea of the Ways and Means is to provide temporary short-term financing. And that is why in the CBN Act, the provision is that the CBN should provide only 5%, maximum of 5% of actual revenue of the previous year to the federal government by ways of Ways and Means. And the Act further states that before any additional funds are released or provided under this facility, what was owed in the previous year must have been repaid. That is what the Act says. But unfortunately, the reality is completely different. Ways and Means have almost now become a mainstream source of financing of federal government expenditure. Yes, there has been argument that we had challenges with COVID and all of that, but it's almost inexcusable that we allow the Ways and Means or this short-term financing facility to grow to the level that it has grown to. Now we are talking about over 22 trillion. So that is an issue, and it has a lot of implications for the economy. In economics, CBN financing of deficits, because that is what this is regarded as inflation tax. It's highly inflationary because it is high-powered money. So when we talk about excess liquidity, inflation, the CBN mopping up liquidity, increasing CRR and all of that, the biggest culprit in terms of this liquidity injection into the economy is actually the CBN itself. So that is where we are. It has raised some serious constitutional issues. There are issues of flagrant breach of the CBN Act. There are also issues of the flagrant breach of the Constitution, because the National Assembly itself is in a quandary. You have 22 trillion naira that have been brought before the National Assembly for approval. And they are wondering, how do they approve money that has been spent? That is not, there's no provision for that in the Constitution. So it's a major constitutional problem. There have been violations on the part of the CBN and on the part of the government. But above all, from an economic point of view, it's highly inflationary. So when we are saying that we have high inflation, apart from the problem of Ukraine, Russia, COVID, and all of that, this particular monetization of fiscal deficit, that's how we call it in economics, it's also highly inflationary. So that is what it is.
All right. Let me also, compare Dr. Yusuf's economic analysis now with that of Olusegun Elemo, who is also joining us virtually. So what do you make about this CBN's intervention and then the seeming illegalities of the CBN Act regarding this kind of intervention, Olusegun? Hello, Olusegun, do you have the question?
I can hear you very well.
Yes, what do you make, having listened to Dr. Yusuf's analysis of the ways and means and, the possible illegalities in the CBN Act as to the cap of intervention that the CBN can grant the federal government, where do you stand in this issue? We understand that the Senate has not even yielded to the request of the federal government regarding the ways and means.
Well, yeah, I did hear Dr. Yusuf very well on the legality of what the CBN, had, financing that the CBN had provided to the federal government. And just to say that this financing has been on, prior to even this administration. But I think the key issue that Dr. Yusuf raised is about the legality and the fact that the CBN went above the cap limit. That in itself is one thing that I expect that the National Assembly, given its constitutional independence, should be looking at, because it sets the precedent for, future governor of the central bank. And that is horrible, to say the least. But other issues that should also be addressed are, issues of how the financing itself, was utilized. What exactly was the money used for? I think that itself has not been brought, that information or that explanation has not been presented to the National Assembly, at least before the last recess. The subsidy that government provided for in the 2023 budget is about 3.3 trillion. Between January and August in 2022, the government itself spent about 2.56 trillion. Altogether, between 2022 and then May 2023, government would have spent about 6-7 trillion on fuel subsidy. And then the finance minister says, yes, they are committed to removing subsidy, but they don't know how to go about it and that they have to consult and all of that. You see, all of this, given the rising debt stock of the country now, it defies logic, really, because you cannot have, fiscal crisis in your hands, and then you are spending reckless. It doesn't make any economic sense. Because even the implementation of the subsidy regime, I think it's one thing that state actors themselves within government, have criticized. Both the National Assembly and even governors, even at the governors forum level. So these issues, I believe that really, we should look at it. And the institution that should be at the center of looking at it is the National Assembly. But unfortunately, they aren't doing what they are constitutionally empowered to do. Because if they are actually playing stronger oversight on the implementation of the budget or economic activities of the government, they would have seen all of these ways and means financing by the central bank before now, and they would have questioned it, and perhaps possibly they would have stopped it. And like what Dr. Yusuf said, the ways and means contribution to inflation pressure would have been curbed. Maybe, perhaps, the food inflation we have on our hands wouldn't be this much. So these are issues, and it's pathetic that we have to leave this amount of debt for the next government who's going to come and deal with it. But I think we also have to look at how the financing itself was utilized, whether it was utilized in an accountable manner. Because I said accountable because when you look at the precedents, for instance, look at the implementation of the 2018 budget. About 70% of funds released to about 79 agencies of government was not accounted for. When you come down to 2019 budget implementation report, about 20% or thereabout of funds released to 70 MDAs was not accounted for. I mean, that's just, to give you, a perspective of what's happening within government. So whatever the CBN provided for financing, yes, there are infrastructure everywhere, the Second Niger Bridge, the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, and what have you. But how are the procurements, implemented? Were they implemented in an accountable way? Look at the subsidy regime. It looks as if we're financing, a group of people. So these are issues, that should worry all of us, but more particularly should worry the National Assembly at this point.
All right. Let's go on a break, and when we come back, then we'll allow Razak speak to us in the implication of all of this. Now, you're watching TVC Breakfast. Let's go on a short break. We'll be right back. All right, you're watching TVC Breakfast. We are looking at the implication of the request by the federal government to borrow about 23 trillion naira, as a part of the Ways and Means loan. That is before the National Assembly. Nigerians are reacting to it, seeing that there are implications to it. And Dr. Muda Yusuf has told us that there's a lot of illegality from the Constitution to the CBN Act, and so on, as a way of making us understand some of these things. Now, let's bring Razak Olokoba in here. Now, Nigerians will say, since the last 23, 24 years, or even before that, every single year, there is monies for debt repayment. There's monies for a chunk of our budget.
That's budget.
Yes, a chunk of our budget goes into debt repayment or debt servicing, as it is called. Now, all of these borrowings here and there, do you see justifications for them, really? What's your take on that?
Well, we as a public administrator, I'm a chartered public administrator, we differ extensively with positions of economics and financial experts on public issues of this nature. First and foremost, Nigeria needs a lot of enlightenment and education on what kind of economy we run as a nation. We run a capitalist economy, free market economy. It is difficult to run a capitalist economy without taking loans and facilities. In fact, that is the foundation of capitalism. And if you flow from that, you will agree with me that most cases, all these financial institutions, financial sector, they are not, in most cases, saddled with the responsibility of offering loan at times. It's just a platform, a business platform, where nations transact business. Before now, nation and international agencies and businesses do business and they get paid. But because of lessons learned by multinationals, change of government, inconsistent government policy, there's that fear that if I do business with a particular nation, a 30-year public-private partnership might get truncated by the coming government. So World Bank will wade in, and it will come as a form of facility to your nation. So either government goes in and come out. Once you key in as a nation into the global world economy, you are bound to obey the rules and regulations of the World Bank, of the IMF, London Club, and Paris Club. So it becomes a loan. So essentially, when you see America going to World Bank, it is not because they go there to take loans at times. It's because they go there at times. Okay, they are in Ukraine now. All the armament going into Ukraine is facilitated and arranged by all these financial institutions in form of loan and facility and to be paid back. So that maybe after the war, your people don't want to pay the loan back, the money back. It's a loan. And that's what brought about the question of Sukuk. Going to the German the trade agreement between Russia that has broken down because of the recent Ukraine war, and so many other facets. So the country, our own country, is lagging behind because they probably don't understand the concept. When people hear loan, they think it's money. And that's why you see those money, you see it tied to a particular project. Say, they are borrowing us money and they are tying it to a project. No, it's not IMF that is tying your money to anything. It's your country that is going into trade agreement with international institutions. Because IMF and World Bank is there as a mediator. So you must pay that money back for 30 years. And that's the picture we also have in Nigeria. That all those loans are tied to a particular project or the other. You see Minister of Works talking about Sukuk loan and train the Chinese government come down. So that's how it comes with. It's not as if they just go there, take money. That's one. Two is that when you talk about, we don't call it breaking of law. It's a necessity. The alternative to not running your economy is for government to be stagnant.
No, but when you in a situation
Mike,
where laws
Mike, what is the
made,
alternative? No, let's when the chiefs are down, what is the alternative to what the government has done?
The point there is they have all.
We have gotten to a point where people should not talk about problems without solutions.
Yeah, but the point
I've gone to a realistic point in our life.
Nigerians, even analysts have said that government should expand its tax net. A lot of people are not paying taxes. If you expand the net and people pay taxes, you will raise your money.
Blame the government for that. But at the moment when you want to run government, if you want to pay the school fees of your child, you won't say because your salary is not paid on time, you won't borrow money to pay the school fees. Because in 2 weeks' time, his mates are gone already. So things we need to survive as a nation, you can't tag behind when it comes to development. You must work at the same level with the development. You can't be riding us as a means of transportation when other nations are going into metro line. So you must provide metro line for your people. When you have the cash flow projections that this money will be paid, you can borrow. So in Nigeria too, the debt office giving us this information, most times it is a responsibility for them to inform us that your nation is owing to up to so amount. It is also part of their responsibility to point out areas of challenges, not only to federal governments, but also to states. And sound a note of caution, just like what my colleagues have said, that this particular state must not borrow again. Rather than borrow, they should begin to look inward at what you have to start looking at what you can do instead of borrowing. And that has been our advocacy for a long time, that the federal government is also held responsible on this one too, that give states the power, devolution of power on resources to be able to look inward. You can't blame states going to Abuja year in, year out, cap in hand to get their monthly allocation. You can't blame state when you tie them with laws that you cannot have access to your natural resources. So that's the responsibility of the development office, not to only tell us about our status, but to also go further to analyze. It should be part. This is not part of the responsibility. That means something is missing as part of the work they are supposed to be doing. They must proceed further. Now, where you find ourselves today, private sectors lack the courage, and I put it to my own colleagues too. I'm a member of numerous professional bodies, and I put as a challenge to us that we lack the courage to point it to the government areas where our deficiency is as a nation, and that area is simply over-reliance on a major source of income. There's a global recession in the world, but what led other countries into global recession is different from what led us into global recession. Our peculiar situation in Nigeria today, we should be making the Russia and the Ukraine crisis now by selling gas, selling oil, and numerous other things. But the way it is other countries should not have hit us in that manner if we had done the right thing at the right moment. So private sectors are always quick to say what the government is doing are not right. Every one of us have a role to play, and part of the role of the private sector is to consistently tell the government that there is no guarantee of prosperity for Nigeria if you don't review the way we make money and our government does business in Nigeria. There's no way of guarantee. So I don't see any alarm in what is happening at the moment. What has happened? I don't see any alarm. What has happened to Russia, happened to America is a child what has happened to Nigeria. The lending institutions knows very well that a nation that borrow and have capacity to pay and who don't want to pay have punitive measure. Cuba at a point said that money taken by Cuba, by previous government, by the Sudan government, is not only unpayable, but it's also uncollectible. But today, Cuba is under economic sanction. So it is a consolation that all major countries in the world today are into agreement that once loans are taken, it must be paid back. And that's why it's become a platform for transaction of business. It's not essential to borrow, no. So when you see oil-aging industry, telecoms industry, oil and gas industry doing business with your nation, they don't want to do it directly again because of fear of what Cuba has done. So they go to all those platforms to transact their business because you have a responsibility to pay back.
Okay. Right.
Okay.
Mr. Olokoba, let's put you on hold now here in the studio and get some reactions to your position from Dr. Yusuf, for instance. Now, beginning with you, Dr. Yusuf. Well, Mr. Olokoba has said, amongst other things, that greatest economies of the world have always resorted to the issue of borrowing. Mr. Elemo was saying earlier on that in the Nigerian context now, the concern for him is, what we are doing with these loans that we get. And we've heard the government talking about, defending the reason why we've had to resort to borrowing. But for economists and other observers, a key issue is our debt servicing to revenue ratio. We even understand from records that figure, that rate in Nigeria is higher than the 22 point something that the World Bank said should be the peg for economies such as Nigeria. What do you make of this and the implications for the Nigerian economy?
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree to some extent with some of the submissions. But let me say that as a country, we have a responsibility to govern within the bounds of the rule of law. All countries are governed by law, whether we are talking about the federal government or the CBN. The CBN has the CBN Act. The federal government also has a responsibility to operate within the law. They should operate within what is provided by the Constitution. That is why when people are being sworn in, they say that they swear to uphold the Constitution. So in this instance, there is clearly a case of breach, which I think as much as possible we should not allow or encourage going forward. Now, the debt situation is really very, very disturbing. It's frightening. Now, if you securitize, that is converting the 22 trillion into bonds. That is what securitization means. So that you can take it away from the central bank and domicile it with the DMO. That is what, that debt management of it, that is what will bring the totality of the debt to 77 trillion. Now, that has not taken account of the current borrowing in 2023 budget. The deficit in 2023 budget is about 11 trillion. And the federal government also requested and also got supplementary budget approval of about 800 billion. Again, that's to be financed from borrowing. So by the time this administration is leaving, we are looking at a debt profile in excess of 80 trillion by December. That is the reality. And it's something that should worry us because we are getting to a point where the totality of revenue that you get will be consumed by the debt service. And the thing about debt service is that it is first line charge. When we say first line charge, what we mean is that it is a priority over any other expenditure.
Yes.
And that has implications for our investment in infrastructure. And this heavy borrowing also has implications for private sector lending within the financial system. But that's what you call a crowding out effect in the credit market. Domestic credit to private sector as a percentage of GDP is just about 15%. That shows the level of connection between the financial system and the private sector. And if you want the private sector to grow, you should be doing lots more, a much higher percentage. In some economies, it's over 100%. Sometimes up to 150%. Just to demonstrate how the financial system supports the private sector. So it has a crowding out effect. And we should be looking at going forward. How do we deal with this situation? When we have a debt crisis or a fiscal crisis, there's an expenditure component of the solution. There's a revenue component of the solution. The expenditure component is to look at the totality of our expenditure and see where we can pull down expenditure so that we can achieve what we call fiscal consolidation. That's ensuring some balance between expenditure and revenue. And one of the things to do to reduce the pressure on expenditure is the subsidy issue. Of course, the government have been talking about it. We have been told that this will go by middle of next year. I hope that the next administration will have the political will to push it through. If we're able to push that through, at least we'll be saving close to 6 trillion in terms of expenditure. And apart from that, one of the other important elements or objectives of ensuring that we reform the oil and gas, particularly the subsidy, is also to stimulate investment in that sector. Right now, the sector has a paucity of investment from the private sector, just because of this subsidy and other policy issues in the sector. So if you're able to reform the sector, you get a lot of relief in terms of the expenditure that government is incurring on subsidy, in terms of the investment that will grow, in terms of the tax revenue that will come from those investments, in terms of even the jobs, quality jobs that will be created. So reforming the oil and gas sector is very critical. Reforming the sector also in the upstream, because we are losing a lot of revenue to oil theft. If we're able to stop all of that, the revenue position is likely to improve, both from the downstream and from the upstream. It is also important that we look at the cost of governance. If you look at the structure of the budget, almost 80% is going to recurrent. Only about 20% is going to capital. And even those that are going to capital, what percentage of it is going to infrastructure? Because we need to build the capacity of the economy to be more productive. If the economy is not productive, it cannot generate revenue. You can see the way the private sector is struggling with productivity issues. You know, they are generating power from diesel, Diesel is between 750 to 900. All of these things are crippling investment and are crippling productivity. So if we're able to grow the productivity in the economy, ultimately your revenue will improve. And productivity is about addressing the structural issues of infrastructure. It's about addressing the policy issues. It's about addressing the regulatory issues, so that you create the environment for the private sector to grow. Then we need to look at reform around our foreign exchange policy. Right now, we have a huge foreign exchange subsidy. The central bank is selling our forex to the foreign exchange market at 435 or 440, when it can sell it for 600. In 2022, at least close to $15 billion was sold to the foreign exchange market at around 440 or 435. What stops us from selling it at 600? Because the end users of this foreign exchange are getting it at over 700. If we're able to do that, we'll be making a revenue of not less than 3 trillion annually. And that's been conservative. So that we creep all this foreign exchange subsidy and throw it into the Federation account as revenue.
All right.
This is a major revenue leakage that both the National Assembly and the government have not been addressing. And yet they keep piling pressure on the private sector in terms of taxes and all of that.
Okay. Dr. Yusuf, let me put you on hold a little bit. And before I come to you, Segun, Razak would like to just respond to Dr. Yusuf briefly, and then we get to Segun Elemo to get more of his points.
It's a part of our problem in Nigeria is when we want to solve our problem, we resort to tokenism. With due respect to what my colleague has said about the way forward out of the problem we find ourselves. It's like taking a step forward and 10 steps backward. When you have weak institutions, you are likely to be confronted by issues of inability of government for 7 years to look at a refinery. That's as a result of weak structure. And my colleague is talking about refinery. You cannot leave subsidy out of the current way we run this country, except you beef up your institutions. And why do you beef up your institutions? Because it is your institutions that turns committed public officers as if they are not doing anything. Buhari is not a thief. But because he's surrounded and operates Nigeria with a very weak institution, for me, he has done his best. As weak as the structure is, he's able to do a lot of things that he has done, pay salary and do all sorts of things. But it will be good for us if we admit that our institutions are weak and we have the courage to say that, let us repair it first. There's no way the subsidies can be removed if you don't repair a refinery. But your refinery cannot be repaired if this approach and the strategy you want to adopt of having Dangote refinery and one humongous refinery is not going to work. The cabals that we've always been talking about, it will be made easy for them to sabotage it. But when you devolve power to private sectors to operate modular refineries, give licenses to state to operate modular refineries, how many of those refineries will cabals go after? But we keep have this impression of
licenses were issued at a time, and those guys didn't. From the report we got, nobody went into work.
The trade agreement of those licenses make it look as if they don't want to operate refineries at all. Now look at the conditions. So what we're saying is that we solve our problem, or we leave it as it is and begin to run it by borrowing, by loan, by this kind of complaint. But if you want to face it, all theft is as a result of what you have said, cabals. And also, our security is compromised. Why will your security not be compromised? When you leave the security of our natural resources in the hand of the army and the police without involving state intervention and contributions to it, we are not serious about looking forward. And we avoid it. As far as I'm concerned, what has done is bad. The legacy can put down for his work to be remembered is to lay a foundation for how we are going to have a proper security channel in place, our refiners our oil sector put in place by devolution of power to people to have access to production of oil in Nigeria and not taking it abroad. And lastly, your economy will be stronger when the federal government doesn't hold on to all the resources of the nation. Okay. Give states the power, the capacity, the right to also have access to our resources. Running of train business today, the federal government owes the license only to himself. Power sector only to himself, and numerous other sectors like that. You can't run the country like that and expect to prosper. So on loan, as far as we are concerned on loan, there is no need for us to panic. If you want to reverse the way the global practice in a capitalist economy, let's know we want to become a communist country where everything is in hand. But when it's almost it's a private sector owned, the major foundation for running a capitalist economy is actually loan.
Okay. Segun, let me come to you on this. At the point there is, recall that there was a move by government officials to push for loan forgiveness sometime last year. And this has been done before in the early 2000s, where Nigeria's loans were forgiven. And everyone said, okay, fine, we've come back to the default and we're starting all over. But here we are again. In fact, the loan at this time is far, far, far more than what was forgiven in the early 2000s. But is Nigeria ripe for a loan forgiveness, or what would it look like, really?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. Before I come to the issue of whether Nigeria is ripe for loan forgiveness, debt forgiveness, whatever the nomenclature, it is to quickly point out some of the things that Mr. Azad mentioned in the studio. That to say that we cannot remove subsidy, is to go the lazy man's approach to public administration.
No, I say we'll be unable to remove it.
At the end of the day, it will be about setting your priority. Now, I give you an instance. The federal government is contemplating increasing salaries of civil servants. Where would the federal government get that money from? Is it going to be printed again? Will the CBN provide additional ways and means to increase salaries? And even if you increase the salary prior to the elections, and then we have a new president in May 2023, and then the subsidy is finally taken off, won't the civil servants request for additional salary increase? I mean, these are questions and thoughts for public administrators and those responsible for public policy. I suggest that we should have, removed subsidy a long time ago, probably over a year ago, and use that money in a more responsible way and not to subsidize a few people who are playing in the oil sector. Because even as at today, you buy, I was watching on TV yesterday a woman who was in Rivers State and had bought petroleum products for 600 naira per liter. Is that a subsidized product? Even when the subsidy regime was effective, the prices were not unified across the country. So really, these are things that we should not, even consider. And, earlier on, we're discussing debt service to revenue. As at Q3 2022, debt service to revenue was about 83%. And World Bank projection at that time was that by Q4, in fact, debt service would have, overrun the revenue of the country to about 102%. So these are issues, and those responsible for public policy and public administrators, should really take a keen look at these issues and, make the best decisions. For instance, today, the money you would have spent on subsidizing petroleum products, giving a few people, why not share it amongst the 3 states of government and let each state determine whether to continue fuel subsidy or not? For instance, Oyo State might not want to implement subsidy and rather give civil servants and upscale their salaries, while Lagos State might decide that they have more money and continue the fuel subsidy regime at state level. You see, these are also issues when you have one policymaker at the center implementing policies for 36 governments. But going to your question about whether Nigeria is ripe for another debt forgiveness is to say that, yes, at the end of the day, we put, our offers forward. I understand that the federal government is considering implementing climate change commitments and believes that perhaps Africa and Nigeria in particular need to explore some more, energy sources to industrialize our economy. And if the Western, the Western world is requesting that Africa and Nigeria implement climate change commitment, the federal government is saying, yes, you have to provide some sort of subsidy. Again, subsidy, because when you forgive debt, it's still another kind of subsidy. So I think, yes, is to, at the end of the day, is left for the players at the global level to determine whether Nigeria and Africa implementing climate change commitments and energy transition programs will be more beneficial to them than having Nigeria repay some of the loans that it are taking. But if you ask me, this is a lazy approach, and I think we should look inwards.
All right, Olusegun, let me come back to the studio. We have less than 2 minutes now, but I want to get Mr. Olokoba's reactions now, because now, of course, we are on the eve of elections, so to speak, and this issue of Nigeria's debt profile has come up robustly somewhat across the presidential candidates, with some saying the way to go now with this humongous profile that we have, even though that is a debatable position. You've stated your position, but then where are we headed? As part of possible solutions, Nigeria is still said to be consumer driven as against production oriented. Do you see that as a way out? Do you see that as a possible solution for us to better manage our debts?
And that is why I've said that someone among the guys coming up to become our president should be someone who has demonstrated that peculiarity to run economy that is similar to Nigeria. That should be our outlook for somebody who must vote for. Someone who has that capacity. Peculiarity of Nigeria, where we have all this kind of crisis, and he brought it together. That should be our outlook. The president has an assignment, and the assignment is to provide a soft landing for the guys coming on board. He should do a structure for the country oil sector to be inherited by the coming president in such a way that we can run our economy without subsidy. I said that the way it is at the moment, you can't remove subsidy. You can't remove subsidy and you leave Nigeria at the mercy of the people in the oil business. We'll be buying oil 5,000 naira per liter. What I'm saying essentially is that the government has a role to play if the prices of oil must come down. And one of it is that the requirement to refine oil in Nigeria is cumbersome and difficult.
Okay.
Well, and two, that the loan that we're all talking about now, the best thing that I think we should do at the moment is for the president to be able to explain to Nigeria. That will be the biggest consolation. Okay. Well, Fashola has done a bit, APC spokesperson has done a bit, but we need more of what the loan has gone into. I am convinced, but many Nigerians
unfortunately, not so many Nigerians believe that with the body language of the current president, he has that way. His operation is not coming to explain to Nigerians what goes on. We've never really seen him explain things in that regard.
It's not good for him.
But it's okay.
There's a life after presidency, and he will be assessed based on his the way he exited.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But however, it's all right. We have to wrap up here now. We must thank you, Razak Olokoba, for coming on the program.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Dr. Muda Yusuf, thank you very much for being on the program. Thank you for your insight. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And Segun Elemo, thank you very much for coming on the program as well. We really appreciate you too.